Health inspectors of Reddit, what's the worst violation you've ever seen? My stepmother is the lead health inspector for a decent sized suburban town. While I have never asked what the worst thing she has witnessed as part of her job was, I do know of one instance that was pretty gross. A truck full of lobsters was traveling down the highway and crashed. The police came, and eventually they towed the truck. As a board of health inspector, my stepmother was consulted to see if any of the lobsters were viable, and she told them no, the load is a total loss, since there were literally lobsters scattered across the highway covered in dirt, sand, etc. Fast forward 24 hours, and one of the restaurants in town ran a special, twin lobsters for $19.99. Apparently the owner of the trucking/towing company knew the restaurant owner pretty well, so they made a deal whereby the restaurant would pay a very discounted price for the road lobsters. The restaurant would turn around and illegally serve the lobsters to unsuspecting customers or sell them out of a truck behind the restaurant. I'm not sure what the repercussions were, but I think they were shut down for like a week. They closed shortly thereafter, and now there's a new restaurant there. The towing company lost their contract to tow vehicles/semi trucks with the town and state. Did food safety inspection at a large slaughterhouse for a while. We did our own inspections each shift, and the government inspector stopped by once a day. 2.1 day, I came round a corner, and one of the workers who was running service for the butchers had dropped a ham on the floor. So, the proper way to handle this for him was to leave it there, and call for a re-inspector to come pick it up, take it out to carve off any contaminated bits and rinse it in boiling water. Now it relatively often happened meat was dropped on the floor. It's just very hard to avoid it when running in a factory setting with human labor. So this was common. What was uncommon was what the guy did. First he tried catching it as it fell, which would have been fine. No contact with any surface, and he could just thrown it back into the tub it had fallen out of. He didn't catch it though, and it landed on the floor. Thinking that Noon was watching, he tried picking it up and dropped it again. He did this 3 times. So first and foremost, he's not supposed to be touching anything that's been on the floor. It cross-contaminates his hands, and he has nowhere to put the contaminated product anyway. But he did this 3 times and dropped it 3 times. Freshly carved hams can be slippery when wearing vinyl gloves. He then, out of pure frustration/annoyance at the unwieldy ham, dropped down on all 4s and proceeded to pick up the raw, freshly cut, 6-kilo ham by his teeth. Stood up, ham dangling from his chompers, and dropped it into the tub with around 600 kilograms of product, and drove off with the tub for processing. He was fired a few minutes after that, and the entire tub of product discarded. I wish my wife was a Redditor. She would own this thread. Here are a couple I remember from her days as a restaurant inspector for the state health department. A complaint from a grocery store that the Chinese restaurant next door was raiding their dumpster each night and taking all the produce they could find. Walking into another Chinese restaurant and seeing pigeons in a cage in the back room. Just regular city pigeons. Asking, "You're not serving these to the customers, are you?" And being told, no, those are just for us." I don't mean to disparage Chinese people by citing 2 incidents about Chinese restaurants, but the truth is that many Chinese people come to the US on a shoestring budget and cut corners as much as they can. Plus, the standards of healthy food service are often very strange to them. Telling someone that they can't cut the lettuce for the salad bar with the same knife they just used to cut a raw chicken is like telling them they have to stand on their head before cooking something. They just don't get it. They always did it this way at home. Your body gets used to fighting off the bacteria you grow up with. People from the other side of the planet have bodies that can handle bacteria we aren't used to in the Midwest part of the US, but that's a very hard point to get across. Here's one more from another side of the economic spectrum. I have a friend who plays in a band which has some national recognition. I won't say any more, but they've had a few top 10 hits. He told me once that his band was booked to play a very expensive corporate New Year's party for a very rich corporation. The party took place at a very swanky hotel in a big city. He and the band had to load in through the hotel restaurant kitchen. Unfortunately, the sewers had backed up, and the entire kitchen of the swanky hotel restaurant was ankle deep in raw sewage. but there was no way the hotel manager was going to go out into the party room and explain to a host of $1,000 a-plate diners that the kitchen was closed on New Year's Eve, so the kitchen staff kept cooking and the waiters kept serving. They put on rubber boots before entering the sewer/kitchen to grab the next plate. The moral of the story is that food service is all about the money first. Understandable, because if there's no money, there's no food service. But you are just as likely to get food poisoning at the most expensive restaurant in town as you are at some local hole in the wall. Sometimes more because there's more money at stake. Not a health inspector, but my mom told me this story some time ago. When she was in her early 20s, she had started working as a waitress for the restaurant in this big fancy hotel. Just a few days after she started working there, the hotel was hosting some big event, so there were a ton of super rich people staying there, and thus the restaurant was super busy point. So my mom goes into the kitchen at one point and sees that one of the chefs is clearly sick. He's coughing and hacking and continually wiping his runny nose on a handkerchief right as he's making food. So my mom goes to her boss and is like, hey, this chef is sick. He can't be working right now. He's gonna make everyone sick. Her boss tells her that the guy said he was fine and to not worry about it. So my mom goes to the sick guy and tells him that he has to leave to prevent the food from being contaminated. He tells her that he tried to call in sick, but the boss told him that they were going to be too busy and they needed him, and if he didn't show up for work, he'd be fired point. So my mom goes back to the boss and he admits that yeah, he knew the guy was really sick, but he didn't care if everyone else got sick as long as they got through the event. My mom tells her boss that this is wrong and that he needs to send the guy home, take back everyone's food, refund their money, throw out all the food that may have been contaminated, close the place down and clean it up. He simply laughs at her and tells her she's fired. So she went and did the logical thing. She walked out into the dining room, stood on top of a table, and shouted to everyone at the event that the boss forced a sick man to work today and all of their food was probably contaminated. There was practically a riot. Everyone crowded around and screamed at the boss, demanding their money back. In the end, the restaurant was temporarily closed. Everyone got their money back. The boss of the restaurant was fired by the owner of the hotel and mom got to keep her job. When my son was 5 or so, we had a nanny who used to look after him, and she used to take him to a local pub where one of her friends worked. He got used to sitting at the bar, eating a packet of crisps, chips, and drinking a soda. I'm starting to realize, as I recount this, as it doesn't reflect too well on my parenting skills. Oh well, he's 17 now, so I guess it's too late for social services to come and take him away. Anyway, the nanny was great, no matter what you might say. The nanny and her friend were round the corner in the other bar chatting away when a couple of besouted gentlemen wandered into the bar. My son was laying a line of crisps along the bar, and one of the gents started talking to him. It's worth noting that the regulars in the bar were used to him being there and often referred to him as the boss. They let him pour them drinks and so on, ostensibly under the supervision of the bar staff. Needless to say, it's illegal for 5-year-olds to be employed as bar staff, even in the UK. I'm in charge here. Would you like a drink? Offered my son, scooting round the back of the bar. No, it's okay, thanks. What are the crisps for? Oh, I'm feeding my friend, my son replied. Really? Where's your friend? He lives in that little hole. My son pointed to a hole in the wall towards the end of the bar. And sometimes he comes out, and I feed him. On cue, a small mouse appeared out of the hole, ran along the bar, and started eating the crisps. The men were environmental health officers. The pub was shut down that week, and never reopened. Luckily, they weren't police, otherwise the nanny's friend would have been in serious trouble. This story was pieced together from the report of the nanny, and also my son, who thought the whole thing was hilarious. The nanny's friend was quite relieved as she hated the job anyway. Edit. I'm not a health inspector, but I've worked in dozens of fast food restaurants in my teens and 20s to know a clean kitchen from a dirty one. I worked for a company that made take and bake Chicago-style vegan pizzas in Seattle. Having worked for many fast food restaurants, I was shocked at the following point: no ventilation. They pre-cooked the pizza crust in large walk-in ovens. But the ventilation fan above it never worked, so a few times a month people who go home early from breathing in too much exhaust. No smoke detectors, fire extinguishers anywhere. When a small fire did break out, first words from the boss were, "Why did you call the fire department?" None of the food, be it canned or perishable, was ever dated. When it arrived, the dough roller was cleaned only once a month, and only by a professional. Working at Pizza Hut, they cleaned it twice a day. Got an oral warning when I took it apart and cleaned with mineral oil I brought with me. Out of a staff of 10 people, me and another worker were the only ones with food handler's permits. Driver who delivered the pizzas to QFC and Safeway stores had no valid license. Hippie employees built a compost pile for waste, which attracted rats, and when it rained, juices flowed down and under the outdoor walk-in fridge, propped up with cement blocks, creating a cesspool for insects. Hand washing sink was falling off the wall. Paper towel rack was basically a coat hanger nailed to the wall. On storage racks, chemicals stored above canned and perishable food. Cat living in the kitchen, to deal with the rats attracted by the compost pile. Employees dropping pre-cooked crusts on the floor, dusting it off, and using them. Never cleaning the food slicer after slicing up buckets of green peppers, onions, or mushrooms. They had 3 sinks for wash, rinse and sanitize, but all they did was wash and rinse. When I showed them that they needed to fill that last sink with lukewarm water and half a cap of bleach, they often filled it with hot water, thus making the bleach evaporate quickly and defeat its purpose. When I left that job, I reported them to the health board. Mom's an inspector. My favorite is the woman who bought a bulk bag of rice from China. Starts working her way through it, and the rice starts tasting a little funky. Whatever, it's not too bad, and it was a great deal. Gets 3/4 of the way through the bag and finds a dead bird mummified in the rice. The strange taste was because the rice absorbed the bird juices and preserved the corpse. Grossest one is probably the fish place that caught fire, but didn't burn down. Turns out public health and the fire department need to go in to condemn the place. Mom comes in with her hard hat and some bulkers boots, and the fire chief with her. The smell is horrible. Burnt rotted fish is probably what hell wishes it could smell like. Maggots everywhere. Fire chief bails in the first 5 minutes to go puke outside. Mom worked in a slaughterhouse and is metal AF. She just mouth breathes her way through it. Then, she starts hearing little plinking noises and feeling impacts on her helmet. It was faking maggots on the ceiling falling on her. Place definitely got condemned. Most hilarious was probably a call that came through for a skunk bite. Turns out this toddler was at the grandparents' place on the back raised patio, sees a kitty and rushes towards it in excitement. Definitely not a kitty. Skunk sprays the kid full in the face. Kid is screaming, falls on the skunk. Skunk is freaking out and bites the kid. Grandparents are horrified and probably never allowed to babysit the kid again. Saddest / most upsetting are definitely the parents who won't let their kids get rabies vaccines. If you can't quarantine the animal or test the body, you can't know until it's too late. Terrible that parents can condemn a child to potentially die of something so awful and preventable. I hope I'm not too late to this party, so I'm in training to be a health inspector, and where I live you need to spend a lot of time working with a health department and taking classes to be able to become licensed to work in the field. I have seen some interesting shit. Let me tell you, walked into a restaurant where they were adamant about us not going into the basement. Didn't understand why, and we had to go down there to check their chest freezers. Owner is pleading with us to not go, which was strange, and the lights were not turning on, which was starting to creep me out. Grabbed a flashlight and started to trek downstairs. Basement was slightly flooded with rainwater in one corner, not a big deal. I'm wondering why this woman was still acting on edge. Turns out she has an illegal bedroom that's hidden by a cinder block wall. Nobody was in there, but there was an air mattress, a spackle bucket, and a few other personal belongings. Inspected a kitchen where staff were spraying Raid over food that was in the process of being prepared. That same kitchen had absolutely zero thermometers, flies and bugs in the baking materials, sugars, flour, not cleaning surfaces after switching from raw poultry to beef, etc. Nobody had a clue how to run a restaurant there. They did not pass, went to inspect a school cafeteria. Checked the pest control boxes and found a mouse that was there for so long it was nothing but bones and dust. Inspected a live poultry mart due to a complaint that they were dumping mop water into residential streets. I have never smelled anything so foul my entire life. Chickens crammed into cages all too small for them, defecating and pissing on one another. Good lord, it was awful. Surprisingly, the cleanest place that I ever witnessed was a popular fast food Mexican chain. 2 minor things were out of compliance but everything else was squeaky clean. I hope I'm not too late to this party, so I'm in training to be a health inspector, and where I live you need to spend a lot of time working with a health department and taking classes to be able to become licensed to work in the field. I have seen some interesting shit. Let me tell you, walked into a restaurant where they were adamant about us not going into the basement. Didn't understand why, and we had to go down there to check their chest freezers. Owner is pleading with us to not go, which was strange, and the lights were not turning on, which was starting to creep me out. Grabbed a flashlight and started to trek downstairs. Basement was slightly flooded with rainwater in one corner, not a big deal. I'm wondering why this woman was still acting on edge. Turns out she has an illegal bedroom that's hidden by a cinder block wall. Nobody was in there, but there was an air mattress, a spackle bucket, and a few other personal belongings. Inspected a kitchen where staff were spraying Raid over food that was in the process of being prepared. That same kitchen had absolutely zero thermometers, flies and bugs in the baking materials, sugars, flour, not cleaning surfaces, after switching from raw poultry to beef etc. Nobody had a clue how to run a restaurant there. They did not pass, went to inspect a school cafeteria. Checked the pest control boxes and found a mouse that was there for so long it was nothing but bones and dust. Inspected a live poultry mart due to a complaint that they were dumping mop water into residential streets. I have never smelled anything so foul my entire life. Chickens crammed into cages all too small for them, defecating and pissing on one another. Good lord, it was awful. Surprisingly, the cleanest place that I ever witnessed was a popular fast food Mexican chain. 2 minor things were out of compliance but everything else was squeaky clean. Pest controller here. Point: local Portuguese restaurant had an ongoing cockroach problem. This is in England, so it's not just a case of the climate being one that lends itself to roaches. They were in the walls, all over the kitchen, the bar etc. The owner once described to me that he had spotted one right by a diner while they were eating and had to scoop it off the wall before she noticed. Point: I was constantly telling them to clean everything, not leave scraps of food out, combined with my treatments, but every month I went back I'd find crap on the floor where they'd just not been brushing or mopping. Got to the point where they accused me of calling their establishment unsanitary. Spoiler, it was, and told me they weren't going to pay their bill. I then printed off copies of all the files I had of all the visits and treatments I'd done with photographs and sent them over. Amazingly enough, the money was in my account by the end of the day. Point: they have health inspections every 18 months, but there's only 2 inspectors for 3,000 square kilometers and all the restaurants in that area. They simply walk in, make sure the place doesn't look filthy, then give them 100% score. Meaning when pest control is going, this place is a faking show. The owners can go, the local authorities don't think so. I worked in a mall food court and sadly rose to be a supervisor of my soft serve ice cream place. This meant I had to learn how to disassemble the ice cream machines and clean them. Now I know for a fact my location was one of the most diligent about cleaning our machines. Every night we blasted a bucket of high power sanitizer through the pipes and out the front of the machine. I mean, this stuff was faking strong. If you got a good whiff of it your nose would feel like clean burning death. Downside to doing this is you had to again blast clean water through the machine in the morning, or that morning's batch of ice cream would spit out frozen bits of sanitizer water and anyone who ate it would get the runs. If you managed to drink a little of it, you would blast liquid sheet out your ass for a week. Point: anyway, so my job is take apart the tubing and freezing barrel every week and clean it. Each time I would do this, I would basically be cleaning cheese out of the pipe, yellowy lumpy cheese. Once, after a period of bad management, one of my coworkers found a drowned mouse in the machine's freezing barrel. Point: speaking of mice, the place was infested with them. Because it was a mall, there was almost no surefire way to get rid of them. Under our cabinets we would get giant piles of mouse sheet, and I once cleaned under the soda machine to find a mouse glued to the floor by soda syrup. Observing a shift change and seeing less than 20% wash their hands before working. One guy walked directly into the plant wearing his uniform from home, including hairnet, blew his nose into his uniform shirt, and got onto a forklift to start moving ingredients to hand scale. When approached, it was noted he had a cigarette behind his ear. A guy sweeping up wearing blue gloves. In powder facilities it is important for sweeping to be taught correctly, otherwise the motion will send powder from the floor back into the product line. This guy would have been better off just leaving the dust on the floor. After he is done sweeping, he loads up a dustpan and throws it away. He places away the cleaning tools and then starts scaling minor ingredients, sticking the same gloved hand into the tub. He should have discarded the gloves and washed his hands after cleaning 3 inches of dust above product lines, flaking mold above product lines. Flour beetles are not that bad in certain spots. It happens, but flour cakes with humidity in the air. With practice it's fairly easy to tell when the last time a place was cleaned based upon ambient flour dust sticking from walls. But having each layer have a clear path the flour beetles work through, or show that it's been a while before cleaning. They naturally have random motion, but will follow previous paths. It was cool looking like an ant farm point finding a plant that disposed of the antifreeze bottles left by truckers monthly instead of disposing them immediately. Pro tip: antifreeze isn't sold in Gatorade bottles or milk jugs having the ceiling leak in a raw food area. Then coming back to verify it was fixed and it was leaking in the same spot. Point the customer list of who wanted to buy the meat rejected by a clown. Point a pile of meat that was wedged between the dumpster and building while doing a walk around. Point seeing a guy chain smoke cigarettes in his car. Come and not wash his hands. Start scaling wearing personal shirt but uniform pants. When noticed he was being observed, put on uniform shirt but did not button or tuck it in. Uniform shirt was laid over gaylord edge and was noticeably unclean. My grandfather used to be an inspector for the USTA and later in his career became a special agent through the late 70s and 80s. One of my favorite stories of his days on the job was the tale of the roof rabbit salesman. My grandfather, grandmother, uncle, and father all moved to Iowa. It could have been California. It's been a long time since I heard it last. For my grandfather's job, which they moved around for a lot, 8 times in about as many years. They had all just moved into a house in a nice neighborhood and my grandfather was out taking a walk one afternoon, just getting familiar with the area. Point. After walking for a little while he had been noticing signs for lost cats on street lights and he started to wonder if there were stray dogs or coyotes in the area that might be eating said lost cats. Then, a few blocks and more lost cat signs later, a Polish man was pushing around one of those old Timmy ice cream carts and approached my grandfather, asking him if he was interested in buying some fresh meat at a low price. My grandfather, being the government agent and meat inspector that he was, went along with it and asked a few questions. G equals GRANDPAP equals POLISH2G. Sure. Let's take a look at what you got there. P. Oh, I've got some of these roof rabbits. My brother and I got them while hunting just this morning. G. Roof rabbits? What the heck is a roof rabbit? P. They're a special kind of rabbit that can climb, and they like to get on people's roofs and tear up things, but they are good to eat. Here, take a look. The man then opened the lid on his cart and pulled out a skinned animal carcass that somewhat resembled a huge, lean rabbit with the ears cut off, but it didn't look quite right for it to be any kind of legit rabbit. Then my grandfather put 2 and 2 together. My grandfather excused himself and told the man he didn't have any cash on him right then, but he could get some if the guy could come by later, and he would buy some. Then my grandfather ran home and contacted his office to have some more agents sent to his house for a bust the next day. Point. When the next day came, so did the Polish meat man, and he soon wished he hadn't. The man was arrested, the meat confiscated and tested, and high fives were had all around by my grandfather and his co-workers, for they had saved the city from the cat butcher that day. TLDR. Grandfather was asked a special agent / meat inspector, caught Bussy Butcher Pete. Pete never again chopped the women's meat. Edit. Formatting. I'm late to this, but what the hell point, not a health inspector, but used to work for a company that sold catering equipment point. Local restaurant's dishwasher finally gave up the ghost, so they ordered a new one from us. That took a few days to get. Point arrived at the restaurant, where the kitchen was up a flight of stairs. Went up to disconnect the old one, and noticed the huge sink full of dirty grey water and dishes. Pulled out the old dishwasher, to reveal about 10 years of accumulated solid fat and grease behind it. Told the kitchen staff they could clean down whilst we humped the old unit downstairs, and brought the new one up. 30 minutes or so later arrived back in the kitchen to find no one had cleaned. Mentioned this to the owner, who said just put the new one in and no one will see the grease. Point whilst I'm connecting the new one, an order comes in for a bowl of chili. One of the kitchen staff takes a frozen bowl of chili out of the freezer and puts it in the microwave. She then starts washing the dishes in the now cold grey dirty water. A few minutes in the microwave pings. She lifts her hands out of the water, flicks the excess water off, opens the microwave door and sticks her fingers in chili to check how hot it is. Not satisfied, she dials a few more minutes on the timer and goes back to washing dishes. Ping. Same again. Flick the water off, stick fingers in chili. This time it's hot enough, so she takes the bowl out the micro, smooths her finger marks out with the back of a spoon and calls for service. Point I never ate there after that. My mom's a health inspector in LA. She does both restaurants and homes. Restaurant stories range from having food that's been left out in room temp and served, which is a major violation, to cockroaches everywhere. She's closed her share of restaurants, but the area which she serves is pretty popular and more of an affluent area, so major horrible violations aren't that commonplace. She has served other areas before this, but I can't honestly recall too many of the horror stories at the moment. But I remember there were plenty. But her home inspection stories have been some of the worst. Some include walking into someone's home and realizing they've been hoarding things that range back 30 plus years, including food packaging, trash and all the above. She couldn't get into the home and had to call the fire dep to break into it and gave them a notice to clean. She felt bad for the elderly couple because they obviously had psychological issues regarding their affinity to hoard, but they were on their own and had no family and were aware of their condition. The neighbors had requested they clean their property several times before until they gave up and decided to finally call into the city. My mom stayed around though and spoke with the fire dep to see if they could assist the elderly couple in cleaning up and removing what was obviously pounds and pounds of littered trash. The fire dep referred my mom to a company that specializes in assisting hoarders, so my mom called on her own time and arranged for there to assist the couple. Bedbugs galore. My mom walked into a tenant's bedroom who was complaining that the building had a bedbug infestation. The lady was sleeping in a mattress littered with hundreds and hundreds of visible bedbugs, like an unreal amount, yet she still slept in it all this time until finally filing a complaint. She got called into a complaint about foul odors coming from an apartment unit that smelled like feces. She walked in and discovered a lady had somewhere around like 10 to 15 cats and 5 to 10 dogs who were shitting and pissing everywhere. She left everything on the ground and would either cover up with paper or push into one corner. The dogs also appeared to never see the light of day, which was another issue all of in itself. So yeah, I have an immense amount of respect for health inspectors after listening to all of my mom's horror stories. They really are the safety and hygiene police when it comes to restaurants and residential buildings. I used to work for my cousin who ran a janitorial service. One of the places we cleaned weekly was a restaurant bar. You know the type. Dark wood, fake deep red leather, ferns, widescreen TV set. Menu has everything from burgers to pasta. One morning we pulled up to our usual space in the alley. Some of the kitchen staff was there. They did not look happy. One of them was puking. One of them said to us, "Oh, man, you do not want to go in there." But we went. There was a sweet off odor. As we went to the kitchen it grew overwhelming. Turns out that there had been some water problems for some time and water was seeping under the flooring. Every piece of equipment in the kitchen was shoved into the dining rooms. All the kitchen flooring had been removed to reveal a subfloor a few inches below. It was flooded with water from wall to wall. At first glance it looked like a shiny white carpet, but it was a mass of wriggling maggots. I was ever so thankful I had always turned down offers of food we would get there. The place was closed for a few weeks while the problem was dealt with. I never went back. By this point I was tired of giving up all my time for the pittance my cheap cousin was paying me. I wanted to do stuff like study and sleep and find guys to have sex with, and not necessarily in that order. Entertainingly, this was the same bar that years later my cousin walked into an armed robbery that was going on as he headed inside with his vacuum. He and the staff were forced to lie down in the cooler. One busboy started to pray loudly, and my cousin kicked him as quietly as he could to keep him from drawing more attention to them. Nobody was hurt, but the bad guys as far as I know were never caught. New to this, and I know I'm way late. Not an inspector, but very close friends with one that has retired. He told us many stories, but two in particular stick out. Point friend had received several calls about the drinks not tasting right at a very well-known fast food place that uses car hops. He goes over and starts checking the drink machine. Nothing out of sorts. Then he checks the ice machine. Turns out they had sewer problems and raw sewage had backed up into the ice machine. The bottom of the ice machine was full of human waste and the employees were dipping ice without noticing the odor. Shut down for several days. Because of this particular incident, a new law was passed in that town that all restaurants had to have an open air drain in the kitchen area, which means the sewer line had an open gap in it, so if there was a sewer backup it would go all over the floor and not into the sink, ice machine, etc. Point another time a city employee went to the drive-thru of a well-known chicken place and ordered a fried chicken dinner. Got his meal and noticed a foul odor. Took it straight to the inspector's office and said, "Smell this, I just bought it." Inspector goes over and checks the cooler, 57 degrees with shelves of bloated bags of chicken. Asked employees what they thought they were doing, and they told him the manager said fry it up and sell it. He shut it down instantly, told them to dispose of everything in cooler while he watched. Steady stream of customers trying to get in, banging on the doors and yelling. He'd tell them he was the health inspector and they were closed. Customers did not care, still wanted their chicken. Not a health inspector, but my first job, when I was 15, was at this Taiwanese restaurant in Sacramento, CA. Anywho, when I started there, bussiness wasn't so hot for them, so when my boss saw a customer come in, her eyes would literally bulge out her head in surprise, or she sent some money in their wallet. Well, at said restaurant we also served bubble tea. One day a customer comes in on a slow AF day, like didn't see a customer for a good 3 hours. The customer decides to order bubble tea. My boss's husband had told me earlier in the day that we ran out the special cups that seal, so we couldn't serve bubble tea and to let customers know. So here I go telling the customer my money hungry boss comes out and says we can make it. We just got cups in, and tells him to sit and wait. Me being confused as fuck wonders what she's doing. Takes a cup that has been sitting next to the sink all day with what looked like tea and tells me to dump it out. Just as I do that, her sheet kid screams out it's pee. So here I go and dump the cup, and out of curiosity I waffed it and yup at piss. I came back and told her the cup was nasty, probably shouldn't be using it. She tells me to go away, grabs the cup, dumps the piss in the sink, rinse it, makes drink for customer and serves it. Point after that incident noticed this happened often. Her faking 6-year-old wasn't potty trained and pissed in cups, and they always left it by the sink and told me not to touch it. Gross. Well, anyways, after that I emailed the city health and they sent someone down while I was working. You think the story would be over? Well, my boss was shocked to see the health inspector as they go into the kitchen in the area we make the drinks under the sink. She pulls out a bucket and tells me to dump it out. It's covered with a cardboard. So I take it into the restroom and check it was a bucket of sheet. I was so faking disgusted and pissed I left, came back out with a bucket and left it by our table. The health inspector saw it. Let's say they were shut down for a week and I quit. I'm not a health inspector, but I have 2 stories. I worked in a hotel restaurant when I was 13, and as I was taking breakfast out to a customer one morning, a cockroach fell from somewhere in the ceiling and landed on the lady's fried egg. I obviously apologized, turned round and took it back to the kitchen, where the chef took the cockroach off, let it go on the floor, stuck the plate under the hot plate, and moved stuff around on the plate a bit, then sent it back out to the customer. I questioned him and got told that the building is old, so it happens all the time, just normally in the kitchen, not the restaurant. The second was in a convenience store I worked at. A funky smell started lurking in the chiller aisle, which I reported to the manager on duty, who fixed it with some air freshener. Smell still kept lurking, and I kept reporting. About 3 weeks later the general manager and I had a shift together, so I brought it up again. His answer was that the deep clean was overdue on the chiller cabinets. I asked how much by, and he said 18 months. It was supposed to be 6 monthly and done by an external company with magic machines. When he rang, they couldn't get to us for at least a month, so it was decided I would do it. Under the base plate of the milk fridge, there was a 3-deep puddle of putrid, orange, furry, liquidy yuck which had spread to the fridges either side. The neat fridge had about an inch of rotten, jelly-like blood that had dropped from the packages above. I will never forget that smell. They let me clean it out once every 4 weeks after that, so it didn't smell as awful again while I worked there. I'm no health inspector, but I've worked in 11 restaurants in Minneapolis over the last 7 or 8 years. I'm only 25. I was serving at a bar in Uptown, Minneapolis on New Year's Eve when our plumbing went whack. Mind you, it's maybe the busiest rooftop/bar in Uptown. Kitchen in the basement, main floor, then rooftop. Sewage was pouring out of the ceiling into the kitchen, and by pouring, I mean mad sheet flooded our basement and even our main floor. Literally like 6 inches of sewage. You could see sheet and toilet paper. We didn't close our kitchen because it's one of the most profitable nights of the year. I remember seeing drunk girls on the main floor kicking the sewage at each other, thinking this was planned, basically like those soap parties places have. I was at work until 6 AM scooping up sewage with 5-gallon buckets. Happy fucking New Year's also. Same bar used sheety to-go bags and a handle ripped when I was carrying 10 steak meals to our guy that did our alcohol awareness program. That's how faked up this place ran its business, and no one would ever know. We literally paid his services with steaks, not money. Needless to say, a few boxes fell on the floor by the highest traffic area, and probably the dirtiest, because on the basement floor there's only the kitchen and bathrooms. And I mean thousands of people walk through on a busy weekend night. A steak or two fell on the floor and I went in to tell the head chef to refire the steaks because they fell on the floor. He lost his sheet, yelled at me, and said to hand him the steaks. He rinsed them off and threw them on the grill for a few minutes. I refused to bring the guy his order. I wasn't about to break any violations. This is my faking career. A few years ago I was working at a Walmart in Vancouver, BC. I was working the night shift as maintenance person. I was like 115 pounds, and being the only female on the shift often was put on the more gross tasks, mainly because of initiation. They wanted to see if I could tough it out, so I saw my fair share of bathroom horrors. The women's room was always in shambles and totally disgusting. The worst thing however was the first time I gave the staff room a good cleaning. Walking to the sink in the food prep area I smell something kind of musty, so I open the drawers under the sink and find a huge tub filled with dirty dishes, which is also filled with old sink water from the leak. It took me 20 minutes to drain and clean up. The baseboard around the wall by the sink was also water damaged, and when I pressed on it hundreds, and I mean hundreds of roaches came out. This is when I started to notice how many roaches were in the staff room. I went over to clean the windows of the vending machines, 2 soda machines, and 1 snack machine, and when I looked and I saw roaches absolutely everywhere, crawling on things, and it was just disgusting. When I went to my boss to alert him of the problem, I was told to just lay some roach traps between things, and was forbidden to tell the staff anything I had seen. I still told them. My co-workers were eating and drinking from roach infested machines. Like hell I was going to keep quiet. That Walmart was the worst place I had ever worked. Not a health inspector, but former restaurant employee. Thankfully I wasn't working this night, but unfortunately I had to deal with the aftermath the next day. So I used to work at this restaurant in a small town. The town had its own sewer system, and the restaurant was placed right smack dab in the center. So one glorious evening, the town decided to flush out the sewer system, which I'm assuming was a rather normal practice. Everything seemed to be going well until something became clogged under the restaurant. From what I heard, as the night progressed, the water pressure became worse and worse until no water came out at all, which seemed strange. So someone went to go check the water pressure in the basement. Yes, the basement. This restaurant had a faking basement. So poor old cook Joe enters the basement, only to find human excrement absolutely everywhere. It had seeped up through the drains in the basement and had covered the floor. Our boss, knowing how fake the situation was at the time, decided to stay open as long as they could and make as much money as possible. So the restaurant stayed open for some time that night as the boss tried to make as much as he could. I swear they must have gone through every dish in the building. Remember, the water was basically off, so no dishes could be washed. The night finally ends, and now there is this huge mess to clean up. Thankfully, when I came in the next day, I didn't have to clean the basement, but oh my god, could I smell it. I had to clean up the dishes, which took I believe at least 4 hours of me working my ass off to get done. When I left, the restaurant had opened, and air fresheners were put up to block out the smell. But you could still smell it. My god, you could still smell it. I'm not a health inspector, but I did work at a Topper's Pizza franchise in college, where the owner was on thin ice with corporate for not being able to run his restaurant up to standard. I was doing dishes right next to the owner, and the corporate guy, who was there inspecting the restaurant, said, "Well, everything looks pretty good, but you have your vegetable strainer above the flour, which, while only a small violation, is still a violation." The owner promptly responded in a completely jovial tone, "Oh, that's alright, we never use it. We really never washed our vegetables before cutting them up." There was a brief pause before the corporate guy, clearly very angry because of the comment, asked, "Did you just say you don't wash your vegetables?" My boss, flustered, responded through stutters, "And no, we wash our vegetables. We wash our vegetables all the time." But it was too late. He sold the franchise back to corporate about a month later. I got laid off in the process, which is a whole different story. The day it was announced that corporate was going to take over, it was sort of sprung on us in secret. The new managers from corporate just showed up unannounced to begin training the cooks before the new manager showed up. I, a fairly in shape person, was disappointed with myself because I had made myself a pizza or wings or something and ate too much, as third shift delivery guys do when they're at work more or less by themselves for 12 hours at a time. I was sort of rambling to myself, and at the most inopportune time imaginable I yelled "fat" at the top of my lungs. I was scolding myself. Weird, I know. Literally the moment after I shouted it, I walked around the corner from the dishes area to the kitchen to see the new manager, who I had never met before, staring at me. She was a morbidly obese woman, and she wasn't visibly upset, but I knew I must have struck a nerve, and I felt like she'd point for most people. They gave them the option to upgrade their insurance to full coverage and take a pay cut to be a delivery guy, or to work on the line making just about minimum wage. For me, they offered me the door and said they wouldn't fight me filing unemployment, likely because of that previously mentioned incident. I thought the pay cut and everything was a huge slap in the face, and one I actually wouldn't have been able to afford, so I was actually quite glad that they laid me off instead. Not a health inspector, but I experienced a lot at one place I worked at, which was a fairly well-known food chain in central NJ. The health inspector was, well, just okay with what we had going on. It's ironic, when you think about it, how you keep things so clean in the dining room, but as soon as you step behind the counter, it gets so worse. We'd sweep, sure, but there'd always be food, or discarded something on the ground. I can't tell you the number of times I almost threw up while closing and finding moldy food. That wasn't the worst. Sadly, the people who built the place hadn't installed the sewage pipes correctly, so pretty much the entire place smelled horrible. And my manager's solution was spraying a whole bottle of air freshener and or leaving out those air fresheners around the dining room overnight. Not to mention the numerous problems we had with the dishwasher and sinks. Plus, we used outdated chemicals, and I can't tell you the number of times I'd come home feeling like I had chemical burns. The place hasn't been shut down because, after a talk with my general manager, I guess that every place around the East Coast, as it's an East Coast place, has the same standards. So long as you sweep stuff, everything is okay. Oh, I guess I didn't mention that a lot of the people I worked with seemed to not wash their hands, and our gloves tore a lot. Tread carefully, my friends. I have no clue why people think no gloves is a good idea. Raising animals in a restaurant is okay, etc. In my earlier years as a low-ranking supervisor, I worked for a convenience store that sold donuts, coffee and hot dogs. Suddenly one summer a fly problem began overnight. We went from 0 flies to 50 to 100 countable flies the next morning. Now, I thought we would stop selling all food and get it fixed, but management didn't let that fly, and they made us sell everything. 100% of all donuts covered in flies at one point or another. To be fair, we called an exterminator, but it took him the entire summer because he just couldn't figure out where they came from. We got all plumbing cleaned, we bombed the entire building one night, and we had multiple bug zappers. We had an air duct cleaning, and soon after did a remodel. We never found anything in the remodel, but the bugs stopped. It was very odd and disgusting. For another convenience store, we had a very popular soda fountain machine. We cleaned it daily, but it required a monthly maintenance that really only professionals could do. Our company was too cheap, so the ice and water you got from this thing was pretty gross. When cleaning it, I would pull out lengths of puke-colored solid slime from this thing. The same slime would clog the drains every month. How surprising. Well, at this store we also had a septic issue and no leach field. Basically, our septic would overflow weekly. I'm no plumber, but on the 20th pump out or so the guy decided to look at the situation instead of just pumping it out. Again, cheap owners wouldn't fix. He told me someone jerry-rigged the piping in such a way that when the septic overflowed, the sewage would flow into the water line past the already filtered water. This meant for presumably years, when the store's septic overflowed weekly, at least some of the sewage got into the 200 ice cups of soda we sold per day. And remember, they never paid to have it cleaned. And if you were wondering, even after finding this out, they decided against cleaning because they assumed the sheet has already taken care of itself. Since the last septic pump out, they fixed the piping, at least. I quit both of these jobs. We have a locally owned / run family restaurant that everyone loves around our neighborhood. I went in after work one day and met up with a party of about 14 people after one of the high school sports games were done. They had a newly renovated addition to their normal building with more of a patio feel, since it's more of a sunroom area. We're all sitting there when all of a sudden someone sees a bug crawl down my shoulder and down my thigh. I knew instantly it was a bed bug, and it was big and full. I freaked out. Bed bugs are a huge problem in this city, and I got up and looked around and realized I was sitting in a wicker chair. I flipped that chair over, and it was a damn colony of bed bugs. Easily 50 bed bugs crawling around on this chair. My father-in-law got the manager and I went to the bathroom to strip down and remove any extras on my. I pulled off 17 and flushed them down the toilet. I went outside and was combing through my jacket that was draped on the back of the chair, and a cook walked out of the back door for a smoke break. He asked what I was doing, and I explained it to him, and he just said, "God damn, this place is disgusting." I told those guys we had a bed bug problem and nobody did anything. I could see he was disgusted. I walked back in, and they were putting the chair in a big garbage bag, sealing it. I got about 2 bites of my meal, and when that happened, and our whole party stopped eating, we told them we were leaving, and that we didn't want to eat the food anymore. They still gave us the bill, and expected us to pay for the meal we didn't eat, because I literally had bugs crawling on me. They didn't even take the chair outside. They just set it behind an unused bar. I called the owner the next morning, because I knew he'd be in, and spoke to him about it. He then had the audacity to say that I must have brought them in, because they have never had a situation before. The goddamn chair had 50 bed bugs. What person unknowingly brings in 50 bed bugs with them of varying sizes that all happen to leave my body and make a home in the wicker within 20 minutes? From what I've gathered from others, they still use wicker chairs even after that, knowing fully well that bed bugs like wicker. It blows my mind how gross that was and how I was treated. Obligatory, not health inspector, but culinary point. This will be buried, but I used to work for a company that has a park in 2 places in the US and many overseas. At one of the kitchens in the park they would do a roasted chicken, and the extra leftover meat would be used to make BBQ chicken. Over the course of lunch they would just put the leftover chicken under the table in Cambras and wait till the rush was over before they would mix the BBQ chicken. Well, it was under the table for 3 to 4 hours before they got to it to mix it up and get it ready to cool down for the next day. Suffice to say, I never ate at the park with my free passes because I knew how bad the food was up to standards. Also not my normal kitchen. My chef would kill someone for pulling that sheet. Their chef told me I'm temporary and to mind my own faking business. Bonus story. My buddy worked at a different part of the park in a place that serves ice cream cones. One of the workers put the wrong ice cream on the cone, and instead of throwing it away he tried to just flip the ice cream off, but instead the cone and all went into the garbage. He then reached in the garbage to get the cone back. My buddy yelled at him and said that is disgusting, but the guy said he has done it before and it is not a big deal. My buddy made him get a new cone that time. PS. This company also knows when it will be walked, and they have walkers to let every kitchen know on the property before they get to them, so it is ready for the walkthrough. Not a health inspector, however my first job, which I spent a solid 5.5 years at, and was a manager by the time I left, was at a chain pizza place. I worked at 2 stores over that period of time, and have a lot of stories. The first, at the delivery-only store, wherein we were part of a shopping center, and at the tail end of 3 other restaurant sewage. Our system backed up all the time due to the clogs from the other places, and the owners of the building were on contract supposed to fix it / pay for the routers to come out and unclog it. But they never responded to any messages or calls that were left, so corporate, instead of fixing it and suing for the damages it was doing to our profit, having to close down at least once a week because sheet was literally bubbling up from our sinks and rains, decided that the only retaliation we had left was to stop paying rent. It took them another 6 months to finally start talks to get things fixed. The second story was when I moved to store #2, a combo deliver dine-in store. At store #1, all of our sodas were bottled, no soda machine. Here, that was different. My first week there I went to refill the ice station from our ice machine, and I glanced down at the ice that I was grabbing, only to realize there were little black specks in it. I asked one of my servers what that was, and they shrugged and said they hadn't noticed it before. Lo and behold, I crack open the machine. The first time I'd ever dealt with one of these monsters, by the way, and it was absolutely caked with black mold on the inside. I had to call in another manager to run the store, while I spent 5 hours, a box of gloves, several gallons of cleaner, and scrubbing materials cleaning the damn thing out. I didn't let anyone use any of the ice, dumping it all down the sink, while simultaneously trying to get as much to drain at the bottom of the machine as possible. When it was all said and done, the ice maker was clean, and when we had a surprise health inspection the next day we passed with the highest score in the area, and my GM telling me he owed me one. There was this one really small, but fairly popular restaurant. Only had a couple people working there, but world famous for their burgers. Some people would do anything to know the recipe from what I've heard. Anyways, I take a good look around the place before I'm able to actually judge the quality of the food. I ask for one of everything off the menu. I was starving that day, my god. I finish every meal they hand me. Fantastic food so far. However, the one thing I'm missing is their world famous burger, all on its own. As this happened, there was a news report of something about health inspectors. The burger comes out, and right as I take a bite, a damn fly flies in my mouth and I start to choke. I was appalled, because I could hear them laughing as it happened. No one came to help me, and I eventually passed out. I'm sure some time had passed, because when I woke up on the ground somewhere I think I could hear digging, but I was immediately hit in the head with a rock, and knocked back out. I must have been moved, because I was covered in mud, and I was freezing cold. I woke up and saw a police officer in the doorway of the freezer they put me in and attempted to walk over to them to get their help, but she turns around and screams. She and her partner beat me over the head repeatedly screaming "Die zombie." They eventually realized that I was in fact alive and stopped hitting me. The only thing I wanted to do at that point was show them that the world famous burger of Thiz had passed the review as well as everything else. Not a health inspector, but my girlfriend worked in a coffee shop inside a hospital for about a while. They served a particularly well-known coffee chain's products and had lots of their equipment point anyway. Shortly after she started, the shit show began. She decided to clean things as her manager said was normal. Opened a coffee pot. Thick greasy black sludge coated the inside of it. She thinks to herself, they clean regularly, snaps a picture, sends it to me, then tries to clean the pot. There was like an inch of sheet inside that pot, ridiculous amounts of caked on smelly sludge. It became very obvious that the shop never cleaned anything regularly really fast. This crap was in every pot. The espresso machines that had steamed milk attachments had goo and slime stuck up their steaming wands. The utensil holder was continuously circulating water to clean utensils, but the water was never changed, so there was slime coating it. The creamer pots were never fully cleaned and had slime growing over a thick layer of goo. Yeah, it was gross. Shortly before she quit the hospital, invited in vendors for a farmer's market look-alike thing that happened on the regular. Mysterious fly larvae appeared all over the place first, followed by a bunch of flies in employee areas. Not a health inspector, but I do remember a good story from a few years ago. Point Wrigleyville in Chicago is not known as the classiest of neighborhoods due to the fact it's nearly always flush with drunk Cubs fans, but there are still a few decent restaurants in the area. One of the restaurants failed their health inspection due to a live mouse and baby rat in their basement, along with detections of rat droppings throughout the cellar. The restaurant is right across from Wrigley Field and blamed the stadium for its rodent problem, to which the health inspector did not believe. Point turns out the whole neighborhood including residents were having the same problem, so much so that they started their own feral cat patrol to try and eliminate them. This was at the same time that Wrigley decided to renovate their bleachers for the first time in 50 years, releasing several generations of rats into the area. Point I can't say for certain, but the combination of small, dark enclosed spaces supplied with a never-ending supply of stale peanuts and hot dog crusts from above, probably, and over 100 years of unsuccessful baseball probably bred some pretty terrifying rats. Not a health inspector, but witnessed something that anybody could tell you was an obvious health violation. Point over this past summer I worked in this new cafe that opened up in my small tourist town. The place looked nice enough on the outside and had a quaint country feel on the inside. The place where everyone ate was as clean as you would expect, and the kitchen in the back didn't have any major violations that jumped out at you either. So my first day I walked in the back and was greeted by the guy who owned the place. He asked me to wash the dishes that were in the sink, then he would give me the tour of the kitchen, where the food was, where he kept the kitchen tools, etc. So I had my back to him, washing dishes, ho hum. When I turned around and saw him cooking, he was touching all the food with no gloves on. Point toasting bread for breakfast sandwiches, no gloves on. Making omelets, no gloves on. Food that required you to touch it a lot that usually you would wear gloves for, he was using his bare hands not just for breakfast, but every time he made anything he just didn't put on gloves. Also, he seldom washed his hands. There was a box of those noble chemical gloves you'd find in kitchens, and I asked him where you would find more when that box was gone, and he said they were just for show in case a health inspector came in. Point wasn't there long. Not a health inspector, but I'd like to tell you about the McDonald's I used to work at. The sink barely worked. Management never bothered fixing it. It took up to 7 minutes to drain a full sink, and we almost never had hot water. Nothing was organized in the back, not a damn thing despite my trying. Oftentimes the meat trays were never properly cleaned, usually just sprayed down quickly. We cleaned behind the grill once a year. There was always a thick sheen of grease on the floor. This rarely got mopped. People just threw their garbage at the back door to take it out later, allowing it to accumulate right next to the condiment shelf and the cooler. People used to eat straight from the assembled table. Point it wasn't uncommon for all our meat to be almost an hour old on slow days. The oil in the frying vats was hardly ever changed, because only 2 people were ever taught how to do it. Only a handful of people kept the grill steamed and clean. Most people, when they were done something on it, would never swipe the grease into the vats. People would leave the spatula sitting on the always active grill, instead of putting it back in its proper spot. As far as I know, only myself and a few of the more competent managers actually tried to keep the place clean. Nobody else gave a shit. I would completely wipe down and clean the entire kitchen, leave on break, and come back 15 minutes later with it looking like I never did anything at all. The back corral, where the trash compactor was, is where we put our used bun trays and milk crates for pickup later. Nobody bothered to organize these ever, and often just threw their trays wherever they pleased. I once had an entire stack of bun trays, taller than me, slip and fall on me while I was talking out the trash. Gulls loved us, since nobody made a point of cleaning or even sweeping up the area around the trash compactor. People often were too lazy to toss their trash into it and left it sitting in front of the compactor. If they did toss it in, they never compacted it. People were often too lazy to properly tie up and double bag full garbage bags. I had many bags open on me in the back area. We had a guy specifically hired to do our lunch dishes. He worked 2 hours each day. The dishes often never got done, either because of his own laziness or because the sink wasn't faking working. Over half the workers could barely speak English. One of the employees always did a couple of lines of coke before each shift. He constantly sniffed and wiped his nose throughout the day. Suffice to say, not a health inspector. TLDR for you all, nothing incredible, just sharing. CQ terror elsewhere. I have however managed in corporate, franchise and private restaurants, both high end and low. My most gratifying stint was as what my boss lovingly called a fixer. She was enamored of the idea, as that had been her role before moving up the ladder. Business was a franchise chain, selling pizza. One of the things I've learned is that if you really want to know what's wrong and bad, ask the wait staff about the back of the house and ask the cook staff about the front of the house. While most of what I hear is wild supposition, you do get the pointers that will shorten your search and destroy mission by several days. So I came into a location with a warning from on high that this place is faking filthy. I want it to pass inspection by next week. Fire whoever needs it. Those be harsh words. First day in, I asked my newly acquired staff what was up. The cooks actually told me nothing useful, which is unusual in my experience, but the wait staff would have wanted me to think Satan was having political orgies in the prep area. I ended up finding a dish area with no clear distinction between clean and dirty. I also found that every prep surface was passably clean until you looked at its edges or undersides. Some of these prep areas honestly looked like they hadn't been cleaned ever. Bathrooms had calcium buildup in toilets and urinals, stained seat covers and filthy mirrors. The splash areas, give it some thought, were all testaments to the spirit of IJAF. Every drain in the building smelled like the urinals. The last thing is usually a violation in most, if not all, US states, but it honestly sends me full tilt and leads to rampant unemployment. The walk-in cooler had no organization whatsoever. Meats were stored at level or above produce and ready to eat type foods. Nothing was being rotated. FIFO FTW, and out of a walk-in of over 400 FT2 I found only one box that had been properly dated. It was expired. Oh, edited in, and there was this mysterious cult-like religion that included most of the staff. A core tenet of their faith was that the floors did not in fact go from one wall to the next, but ended where you could no longer see them from a standing position. The end result was not mass termination. The truth of the matter is, despite the momentary righteous satisfaction for eliminating incompetence, it's simply unaffordable. What did happen was that the cooks all had to spend 2 nights with me, by which I mean post-close for 8 hours as a mandatory shift, learning how to clean and organize. The wait staff got a similar treatment. However, since their domain was significantly better, their shift was 4 hours edit. Forgot about the floors. One of my favorites, that invariably leads to dad-like head shaking and a chuckle, followed by a son let's talk hand on the shoulder. Not a health inspector, but this story is a pretty popular one among health inspectors. So a health inspector has an unscheduled visit to a nautical themed restaurant, and the manager and cook both seem really nervous about him coming in, because they obviously want a really good review. The cook starts kissing up to the health inspector because he's a little bit of a goofball, but they eventually bring him platters of food. While the health inspector is eating, they get a report of a fake health inspector on the loose, and they decide to mess with the guy's last order, which was a burger. They do various things to the burger, like put toenail clippings on it, throw it in the toilet, putting nasty condiments on it, all the works. The cook brings out the burger for the health inspector, and just before he's about to eat it, a fly flies down his throat. He chokes and in the process of trying to cough it up inadvertently knocks himself out. So these two idiots finally check in on him and think the health inspector is dead. So they do what anyone would and try and bury his body in the local cemetery. In the process, some cops are passing by and ask for a ride back to the restaurant. While talking to the cops, the body wasn't buried properly, so it started to slide down the hill due to the constant rain and shitty weather. The cook ends up putting the body of the health inspector in the trunk of the police car, and they drive off to the restaurant. The cook is having a hard time keeping it together, but the manager convinces him to keep it together and to put the body out by the dumpster. They get back to the restaurant and the back door is locked, so the cook ends up putting the body in the freezer. One of the cops ends up getting thirsty and want ice, so she heads to the freezer and is immediately blocked off by the manager. They start to blame the crime on each other, and when they cops look in the freezer, the body isn't there. They turn around and are convinced he's turned into a zombie and knock him out. They turn on the light and see it's the health inspector. He ended up giving them a passing review, and the manager gave out free Krabby Patties that night. Well, at least half price anyway. I'm not a health inspector, but this is a story from a friend. My friend's mom is a doctor and her sister, my friend's aunt, is a health inspector, or something along those lines. This is heavily paraphrased, mind you, because he told us, a group of us, these stories about 2 years ago. So my friend's aunt works as a health inspector in some city. She receives a complaint one day that an apartment is either smelling really bad, leaking disgusting water onto the apartment below, or that the tenant of that apartment is acting strange. She visits the apartment to find an old lady in it acting strangely and saying something about black magic. Saying something like, "I'm gonna blah 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 to your body for spells." The apartment smelled bad, but they found no overt health or living violation and left. Fast forward some time and the complaints get worse. They return again, and this time find a dead body being pickled in the bathtub for spells. The lady presumably faces legal action. Another unrelated story, but about the same person. My friend's aunt gets several noise complaints throughout one day from certain houses. She travels to one house and knocks on the door. An almost fully naked man answers and mutters something unintelligible, saying something like, "I could work with this," while leading her inside. She then discovers that they are shooting a full-on porno in the house, and that the man has mistakenly assumed her to be the woman employed to keep actors hard in between scenes. She then excuses herself and explains the situation. She answers a few other noise complaints throughout the day, and for some reason they're all doing the same thing, shooting bonus. Chinese poop sauce. One time, I was investigating this Chinese restaurant. A real nasty one. Family owned, you know. Traditional family, so it was a real mess. Bird feathers everywhere, raw goat meat all over the tables. It was pretty gross. It only became more sickening when I walked into the kitchen. Huge vats of bubbling slime were sitting on heaters. They told me they were never emptied, never washed. They just kept adding stuff to the soup. A never-ending pot of fetid ooze. But here's the worst part. When it came to the stir-fries and entrees, the sauce they were using was absolutely obscene. They would have their pigeons eat hot peppers, onions, and other ingredients. They would then wait a day. After a day passes, they'll find the bird, push their thumbs behind the bird's ribs, and break open the live bird to massage the sauce out of the bird's intestinal tract. Yes, even though the bird was broken open, it was still alive and twitching the entire time. I saw it happen, and I will never forget it. Apparently this sort of thing is common and leads to that weird brown sauce you sometimes get at cheap Chinese places. Anyways, the place still technically passed inspection, so I'll let them go.